Well, if you had any doubts, your choir has settled them. Thank you. I've had a pretty eclectic spiritual upbringing. I was raised a Unitarian Universalist. Many of you probably know this. You've read our bios. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in the San Francisco Bay Area with lesbian parents, and so pagan ritual was obviously a part of our family life, earth-based spirituality. Buddhism and humanism were strong influences, and I was also connected to my Jewish heritage through after-school programs and summer camp. And so every year at this time, wherever I am in the world, my heart is with a group of old hippies in Berkeley, who, my parents usually among them, who are sitting around the Seder table celebrating Passover. This particular group has been gathering in various configurations since before I was born. Each year, I remember the excitement of preparing for the Seder, that ritual Passover meal. I remember making all those special foods, the matzo ball soup and the harosis and the gefilte fish. I never ate the gefilte fish. Some people say it's good with horseradish. I don't like horseradish either. And then we would make the Haggadah, right, the liturgy for the ritual meal. The Haggadahs are made and remade every generation, every community to fit those people, that place. Ours, of course, being in Berkeley, lesbian parents, is a feminist Haggadah. Lifted up the female characters in the story. And it also, and this is what I remember most about it, was chock full of really bad jokes. They would seem to multiply year after year. Lines like, why do we eat matzo ball soup on this night? To remind us of the cannonballs that the Egyptian army fired at the fleeing Israelites. They were really bad. And of course, every year then there was that banter afterward about how it was only Martha's heavy sinker matzo balls that were reminiscent of the cannonballs. And you know this kind of moment, right? This moment, community, family, shtick. It stopped being funny long ago, if it ever was. And yet it's become a required ritual for the occasion. A moment that recalls the depth of our connection to one another. And when the Passover meal was finished each year, the children, we would perform a play of the Passover story. I was the oldest, and I confess perhaps a bit bossy, so I would get to be Moses. The oldest girl she would be Pharaoh. We had a good back and forth with all the let my peoples goes and the no and the plagues and so on. And then my brother, he was a little bit more shy. He didn't want a speaking part, so he would play Pharaoh's dog. One of the other kids, he was even shyer. He didn't want to be seen, so he would be the burning bush. He had a flashlight under the sheet and waved around. It was a lot of fun. So each year we would make the play, and we would make the Haggadah, and make all the special foods, but of course, what we were really making was connections. Community. A community of connections, people who could go throughout the years with us, who we could turn to in times of celebration and joy, who would support us through our struggles and sorrows. That Passover story that is told each year usually ends, as we would always end it in our plays, with that successful escape from Israel. Right? The story is about Moses and his call to lead his people, that mystical experience with the burning bush. It's about standing up to unjust power, uniting a people and calling on religious witness to intimidate a tyrannical ruler. It's about the terrible plagues and unleashed on the Egyptian people, about this sort of cosmic justice. It's about taking advantage of the moment and making sacrifices and doing what is necessary in the service of life. And most of all, of course, it's about freedom and a reminder that the power of collective organizing can always overcome oppression. But really, I'm not talking about any of that today. Today, what's on my mind is those 40 years in the desert. Those 40 years in between winning freedom from Egypt and arriving in the Promised Land. Those 40 years that perhaps started with Reuben and Shimon's trek, as Rabbi Lawrence Kushner would have it, across the muck at the bottom of the Red Sea. The Unitarian Universalist poet and minister Lynn Unger, who also made out of Rumi's words that beautiful song, Come, Come, Whoever You Are. Lynn invites us to look again at this story in her poem Passover, using the lens of that 40 years in the desert. She begins with a quote from Exodus. Then you shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts and the lintels of the houses, and when I see the blood, I shall pass over you, and no plague shall fall upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. They thought they were safe. That spring night, when they daubed the doorways with sacrificial blood, to be sure the angel of death passed them over. But for what? 40 years in the desert, without a home, without a bed, following new laws to an unknown land. Easier to have died in Egypt, or stayed there a slave, pretending there was safety in the old familiar. But the promise from those first naked days outside the garden is that there is no safety, only the terrible blessing of the journey. You were born through a doorway marked in blood. We are, all of us, passed over, brushed in the night by terrible wings. Ask that fierce presence whose imagination you hold. God did not promise that we shall live, but that we might at last glimpse the stars, brilliant in the desert sky. We have a magnet on our fridge that boldly attempts to summarize the core of Unitarian Universalism in 4 sentences. Sentences easy enough to share with children. It says this: it's a blessing you were born. It matters what you do with your life. What each of us knows about God is a piece of the truth. And you don't have to do it alone. It's not bad, huh? The words are from our friend and lifelong UU lay leader, Lila Ibrahim. But I know that there have been times in my life when I could only hear that first line, it's a blessing you were born, in a cynical or mocking tone. Times when being born has seemed more a curse than a blessing. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you felt like that? Have you been there? Have you ever doubted the blessing of your life? One of the essential religious questions is, how do we make sense of suffering and evil? How do we make meaning in the face of our struggles? It's such an important question that there's a word, theodicy, that is just for that conversation. And most of you are probably familiar with the traditional Christian understanding of theodicy. Suffering, evil exist in human lives because of original sin. Yes, you got it, exactly. Adam and Eve made a crucial mistake in the garden, and humans have been the inheritors of their sin ever since. Humanity struggles with evil and suffering because of this inheritance. We are inherently flawed. Something's essentially wrong with us. We're born into it, and the only way to make up for it is repentance and salvation, eventually through Jesus, right? You know this story. In large part, it actually comes from Augustine, that Christian theologian who came along 400 years after Jesus and who I think had some serious shame issues around sexuality. Honestly, it's a troubled soul. In fact, it's not difficult to draw some direct lines between his austere approach to spirituality and to the repressed sexualities of Catholic priests centuries later among clergy of other denominations who have committed heinous offenses. Truly, I know of few ideas that have done more damage to the human psyche, to the human soul, than that of original sin. The theological counterpoint to original sin, especially over the last several decades, has been original blessing, touted by Unitarian Universalists and other liberal Christians, and liberal Christians, I should say. The idea of original blessing focuses on the goodness of our lives. It's about celebrating rather than shaming our bodies, our sexualities. It's about lifting up our amazing capabilities to feel and to think, to empathize, to reason through complex problems and wrestle with challenging moral calculus. It's not so much the claim that human beings are inherently good, but simply that it is inherently good to be human, that it is a blessing you were born. I love this idea of original blessing. I've preached about it, especially in regards to our sexuality education curriculum, that Our Whole Lives program that I think is just one of the best things we do. And I think it is a simple, profound way to draw a distinction between what we are about here and those who preach the doctrine of original sin. And yet, the idea of original blessing fails in one key respect. It does nothing to address that question of theodicy. While it is a beautiful contrast to original sin, it does nothing to answer the question that original sin responds to. Why is life so hard? Why do we suffer? Why must the Israelites, after escaping Egypt, escaping from the torment and suffering as slaves, still wander the desert for 40 years? It is our terrible blessing as humans to make meaning in the face of questions like these. To be sure, the angel of death passed them over, but for what? 40 years in the desert without a home, without a bed. All of us spent time in the desert. The Buddha articulated it so simply in his first noble truth. Our lives are laced with dukkha, with suffering. There is no way to avoid it. What have your deserts looked like? Have you been in the desert of loneliness? Or perhaps a relationship that has lost its love? Have you been in the desert of losing or leaving a job? Or of doing work that is numbing or lifeless for you? Have you been in the desert of a journey with cancer or of addiction? Or watching helplessly as someone you love crosses that desert? Do you know that desert of losing a loved one? Of seemingly ceaseless grief? Have you been in that desert that Andrew Solomon names the noonday demon, the desert of depression? What have your deserts looked like? Chances are you've already journeyed a desert or two in your life. Chances are your latest desert will not be your last. And chances are you have not enjoyed being in the desert much. Journeying through the desert, like climbing the mountain or crossing the river, is one of the archetypal forms our spiritual journeys take. We take this journey as individuals, but also as communities. My guess is that for some of you, at times, this interim period, with all its questions, with all its wondering about where you will end up while you seek a bright and vibrant future amidst change and transition and uncertainty, juggling hopes and dreams, challenges and frustrations. This time has surely felt to some like a journey through the desert. And we also know that this community has taken seriously the changing cultural landscape, the changing attitudes about spirituality and changing role of religion in society. Who must we become to be who we need to be to play our part in this moment? What change will be required of us? What must we hold on to with all of our might? In the decades to come, what will it look like to be a relevant, thriving spiritual community that is radically inclusive as it embraces this age of pluralism, that embodies beloved community here and now as it takes seriously the global demands of love and justice? These are big, weighty changes. Questions which all Unitarian Universalist congregations, and indeed liberal religion of all kinds, will be wrestling with for years to come. They are desert questions. Questions that will make us wander and struggle and probably do our share of suffering. Oh, what a message for a minister to give, hoping to serve. Come with me and we'll wander through the desert. And so the story of the desert. One moment the Israelites are dancing and singing on the shore, celebrating their escape from Egypt, and just a few paragraphs in the story later, they are all Reubens and Shimons, whining and complaining their way through the desert. You led us out of Egypt, they snap at Moses, just to die of starvation here in the desert. The promise is that there is no safety, only the terrible blessing of the journey. Now, honestly, I can see myself as one of those Israelites. I do not do well with heat. I hate the way sand gets in everything. I know some people like the feeling of sand between your toes. For me, it's just, you'd never feel clean and without showers. And every day the pressure is building. People are getting hungrier, looking back on life in Egypt. The hard parts, they blur into the vagueness of memory. Being a slave, there was always food. It couldn't possibly be as bad as wandering the desolate wilderness. But even after the food issue is resolved with the magical manna, the complaining doesn't let up. Moments later, the community has already stopped trusting they will be provided for as they cry out for water. Gosh, food and then water, what do these people think? And again, I can really empathize with the Israelites here. Something cataclysmic has happened. Perhaps it's one of those moments I've had a spiritual crisis. Life has wrenched me away from what is familiar. I knew things needed to change, that I needed to get out of Egypt, but now I am overwhelmed by the vastness of the desert. In my life, this has taken the form of 2 times that I've had mental health crises, resulting in deep and lasting depression. And when I've been in the desert of depression, like those Israelites trudging through day after day of spiritual wasteland, I've had no trust that sustenance was on the way. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? And again, even after the staff has struck the rock and the water has flown in abundance, the problems persist throughout the story. We bear witness as the community resists the spiritual journey, seeking instead immediate and transitory comforts. In the desert, many of us will turn to anything that will distract us from our suffering. Many of us know the lure of addictions lying waiting as a convenient way to pretend to escape from the desert, whether it's drugs or alcohol or shopping or gambling. watching TV, or all those silly games that I play on my iPhone. We are surrounded by opportunities to distract ourselves from our deserts, sometimes even making golden calves of our habits and addictions. All of this to avoid that first noble truth of Buddhism. All of this to attempt to deny the reality of suffering, to avoid what is ultimately demanded of every one of us. What meaning do you make in the desert? What do you do with your suffering? Neither original sin nor original blessing satisfies as explanation, and so I think sometimes all we can do is acknowledge that we are bound up in original struggle. We are, all of us, inheritors, not of sin, but of struggle. Of the original struggle of humankind that every member of our far-flung tribe has faced. No matter how privileged you are, no matter how careful you are, no matter how good or kind or loving or optimistic, you too are part of the original struggle. And the good news is this. Inheriting this original struggle connects you to every other person alive or who has ever lived. Inheriting this struggle leads to one of the greatest truths of our tradition: you are not alone. Even when you seem to be journeying through your own private desert without companion, you cannot help but travel in the footsteps of others gone before. No patch on this earth is untrodden. And you cannot help but travel with hands at your back, ancestors and loved ones holding you from afar no matter what. When I first journeyed through the desert of my depression, I was 17 years old. After spending a week in an inpatient mental health unit, I returned home from university, lost and defeated. For weeks, that became months, I struggled even to spend moments alone or to leave the house. I will never forget the first Sunday that I came back to the Unitarian Universalist Church of my childhood. I was bursting with tears throughout the whole service. And as I wept with the sorrow of all the world's woes, I was gently and warmly enfolded into the embrace of my community. What saved me, what healed me, what made me whole was not psychiatrists or the time at the hospital or pharmaceuticals or therapists or exercise, though those were all helpful. What saved me was a religious community, a religious tradition that told me to seek support wherever I could find it. To open to Buddhist teachings and practices of mindfulness, as well as to the wisdom and the scientific traditions of psychology and psychiatry. What saved me was a religious community that told me with so much more than words, you are loved. At the root of it all, there is a love holding you, a love holding all. No matter what you do, or what you say, or what you think, or what you feel, you are loved. When we are held in this love, each journey into the desert offers the possibility of growth and learning, holds hope for a promised land. Indeed, the milk and honey is made all the sweeter for the bitter tears shed while crossing the desert. Sometimes we only know the depth of our joy because of the depth of the suffering it has relieved. But to make that terrible crossing, I found we must learn some desert survival skills. Here are 3 of mine. First, take a page out of the Israelite playbook and complain. Fetch! Moan! The only thing worse than suffering is suffering alone. Second, stop complaining. Breathe. Breathe deeper. Rest in the knowing you are held. And third, find that which sustains you. Whatever your beauty may be, remember that even in the desert, there is a flower that blooms. Friends, our faith may be wandering through the desert. Unitarian Universalism, the way we do church, liberal religion in the 21st century, we do not know if the promised land is right around the corner or 40 years the other way. But this we know. Together we hold in our hands a precious desert flower, more valuable for its beauty than all the manna from heaven or water from the rock. A desert flower that contains generations of love in action, generations of approaching the questions of religion and spirituality with reason, with the intellectual rigor required for the age of information. Generations of making the food and telling the story and doing the ritual so that deep connections can be forged. Connections that are deep enough so that when a 17-year-old or a 70-year-old walks through those doors with only despair in their heart, just brushed by those terrible wings in the night, they find themselves enfolded in the embrace of love. So that they find that though they are journeying through the desert, they do not journey alone. May it be so. Amen.